Hello, and welcome to this presentation on advancing gender inclusion and sustainability in trade. I am Stephanie Honey, a former New Zealand trade negotiator and now an international trade policy consultant. I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Marion Jansen, Director of the OECD's Trade and Agriculture Directorate. The Directorate drives much of the OECD's cutting-edge research and analysis, including into food and agriculture production and trade, fisheries, services, and broader questions around the economic, environmental, and social context for trade. Prior to joining the OECD, Dr. Jansen was the chief economist at the International Trade Centre in Geneva, which is centrally concerned with questions around inclusion in trade, including for women. Dr. Jansen also held positions in the WTO Secretariat and the International Labour Organization, so she is very well placed to give us her insights on this topic. This session will strive to shine a light on the challenges and opportunities for women in trade. Progress towards gender parity has been slow, but the potential gains are very large for economies, communities, and individuals. As we seek to build back better from COVID, we need to put our best foot forward on ensuring that everyone can benefit from the opportunities and share in the benefits of trade and can do so in a sustainable way. So we are very fortunate indeed to have such an authority in this area to talk with us today. And with that I pass you the floor, Dr. Jansen. Thank you.
Many thanks for this introduction, and very pleased to be here with you today, albeit only digitally, at this conference on advancing inclusivity and sustainability through trade in the 21st century. You already heard that my name is Marion, and that I'm leading the trade and agriculture work at the OECD. And the slogan of our trade work is making trade work for all. So the topic of this conference fits very well with the main objectives of the work we're conducting at the OECD. In my intervention today, I will focus on the relationship between trade and gender. And I would like to start my intervention with a little anecdote. You already heard that I started my career in international organizations at the WTO. I worked for the research division there, and I was the first woman to join that division. And when the division wanted to start working on the theme trade and gender, they asked me to do this work. And actually, when I was asked to do it, I refused. I refused for the reason that I did not want to be put in the corner of being the person dealing with the soft issues in the research division. I wanted that my work would be part of the core work of the research division. Fortunately, things have changed. In the meantime, I've worked a lot on the theme trade and gender, but more importantly, the theme of trade and gender has become a core part of the trade agenda, of the trade community in general, but also of the World Trade Organization, because discussions on this topic are going on there. I'm therefore very pleased to be talking about a core theme, trade and gender, to you today. Typically, when we talk about this topic, we look at how women are affected by trade. And when we want to look at this topic, it is useful to distinguish between three aspects. How are women affected as a consumer? How are women affected as an employee? And how are women affected as an entrepreneur? I will focus in my intervention on the last aspect, how are women affected as an entrepreneur? But I will start by saying something on the other two aspects. Research has shown, and in particular work recently published by the WTO and the World Bank, that women tend to consume more goods in which trade is distorted. Women notably consume more food. They spend more of their income on food and therefore on an item where the trade is unfortunately still distorted. By reducing distortions in that trade, women will be made better off as a consumer. When it comes to women as employees, one important finding of that same research is that exporting companies tend to employ more women than companies that are only active in domestic markets. Why would that be the case? Now, one reason is that an exporting company is exposed to more competition. If you're competing against the best on the globe, you have to make sure that you employ the best talent. And you will not mind whether that talent is male or female. You have to make sure that you are out there and can compete against the best. This is one of the explanations economic theory has shown why exporting companies tend to employ more women. And data show this. Exporting companies in the developing world employ around 33% of women, while non-exporting companies only 24%. How trade affects women as employee will, however, also depend on how different sectors are affected in your economy by trade. If women are working in a sector that grows through trade, they will benefit from trade. If they work in a sector that shrinks because of trade, they will lose from trade, at least in relative terms. Women, for instance, are overrepresented in a sector like textiles. Now, if they are living in Bangladesh, which is a country that exports textiles, then women tend to be in relative terms among the winners from trade. If they're working in the textile sector in, for instance, a European country, they will tend to be rather among the losers. So when governments conclude trade agreements, they could ex ante check which sectors they expect to grow and which sectors they expect to shrink, because they will be exposed to more competition. And this will give them a sense of whether women will be rather positively or negatively affected, and they can then design accommodating measures as they consider useful or necessary. These ex-ante assessments are conducted by many countries, and they can be very helpful. So I've spoken about how women are affected as consumers, how they are affected as employees, how are they affected as entrepreneurs. There, the figures are not very positive. In most countries, women entrepreneurs are underrepresented among exporting companies. ITC research has, for instance, shown that only 1 out of 5 exporting companies is owned by a woman. Why is this the case? We know from research that all over the world, women tend to lead smaller companies than men. And we also know that smaller companies find it harder to trade. This is one of the reasons why women are trading less in their role as entrepreneurs. But what are the underlying reasons for the smallness of their companies and for the reason why they find it harder to trade? There are multiple reasons for this. Some are legal. There are still many countries where women find it harder to access resources than men. In some countries, women cannot own land. In other countries, women cannot have a bank account. In fact, in some European countries, the generation of my mother could not have an own bank account without the approval of their husband. So the financial sector is not used to dealing with women. And this is something, even if we have changed the laws, is still with us today. One important thing governments can do is to make sure that in their laws and in their rules, no discrimination is made between women and men, in particular when it comes to access to resources like land or finance, because this is important for women to succeed as entrepreneurs. But even if no discrimination exists, habits, customs, rules, unwritten rules often make it more difficult for women to trade than for men. For instance, in finance, it is rather well known that women find it more difficult to get a credit, be it for trade or to make an investment, than men. Often they find it harder to speak about money with bankers. Often the banker is not used to seeing a woman. These are bottlenecks that can be overcome through training, through exposure, through networking, and a lot of efforts by governments and in the public sector are being made in order to help women access finance more easily. Another area where women find it more hard to access something is information. A lot of information we can obtain through the internet or through books, but a lot of information still flows through networks. And in the area of business and in the area of trade, such networks are often male-dominated. It is therefore important that women get access to these kind of networks or build their own networks. A lot of support for female entrepreneurs therefore goes into the direction of helping women to build networks or get access to the important networks and to feel comfortable there. Last but not least, another area where women have more difficulties is when it comes to getting things through the border, to dealing with processes at the border. Getting a stamp on a document, getting a certificate, getting a payment done has traditionally been more difficult for women than for men because they were discriminated at the border in these processes. This is something evidence has shown. What evidence also has shown is that digitalization of such processes takes this discriminatory factor away. Digital technologies at the border tend to be gender neutral. And it has been shown that where governments have digitalized border processes, women find it easier to deal with those processes than where this digitalization doesn't exist. Something governments can therefore do is to facilitate the digitalization of border processes. A lot has been done, a lot more remains to be done. And a lot remains to be done in particular in this special and particular period where many economies have to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic that has hit many businesses very hard. Some of the sectors hardest hit are sectors where women are overrepresented. I'm thinking, for instance, of the travel and tourism industry. In our recovery strategies, in our strategies to build back better, we will therefore also have to think of how we can make the recovery work for women. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jansen. There's some great food for thought there. But perhaps we could start with your final point, this idea of building back better for women who have been disproportionately hit by the impacts of COVID-19. In the short term, do you think there's any particular direction we should be trying to take to enable women to resume their economic activity? Should we be, for example, focusing on reskilling women or on, renewing growth in those sectors?
I think this will very much depend on in which sectors the women have been working that are hit. There is a lot of thinking going on, for instance, about the question whether sectors like the tourism sector will recover to what they were before. If they will not grow to the size that they had before, then some employees will have to be reskilled indeed in order to find jobs in other places. So reskilling can be important, but it depends on how the sector is going to react. In other sectors, the sector will go back to a normal way of functioning. There it is rather a matter of making sure that the period of lower income or not work can be bridged for men, but also for women. One of the difficulties women often have is that they have a higher obligation and they spend more time on taking care of the family and of the children. In the recovery strategies, this is something that should ideally be taken into account.
Very good, thank you. I would like to take up another of the points that you made, which is goes to the question of the interrelationship between domestic policy settings in this area and trade policy. So you mentioned a number of challenges that women face where some energy could be focused to do with, for example, access to financing or access to information, access to networks. Some of those things are really more to do with domestic policies than they are with trade policies. What do you see as the role for trade policy in addressing this gender gap? How important is that relative to domestic settings?
The domestic settings are key because in order to be, and particularly when it comes to the role of entrepreneur, in order to be a successful exporter, you first have to be a successful entrepreneur. And domestic settings are very important in order to guarantee that women have the possibility to become successful business women. The role of trade policy is, in the first place, important at the border, in the trade facilitation area, as I mentioned. It has to be made sure that women can get things across the border. Now, I've been mentioning in my speech things like getting a stamp or getting a certificate. But we know that in certain countries, women find it hard to cross a border in order and get the paperwork to get to the other side of the border where they may want to sell something. So getting things done at the border is a key aspect that is fortunately being addressed increasingly by, for instance, WTO members. And the digitalization of trade facilitation processes is an agenda that exists aside and beyond of the trade and gender debate. So this is, I think, an agenda that will be pursued and that we will see developing further. COVID-19 may play a role in this because the COVID-19 pandemic has increased investment in the digitalization of trade facilitation. We have seen many governments more rapidly than before moving certain processes to digital ways. And this is something that may be to the advantage of female entrepreneurs.
Absolutely. Although I think one of the interesting findings of that WTO report that you mentioned is that unfortunately we do also see a gender gap around access to the internet and to digital tools. So clearly there's potential for a greater emphasis from policymakers in that space.
I would maybe like to say something on this. You're absolutely right. It's well known that women are less represented, for instance, in studies related to STEM technologies. Women are less active in digital technologies. Maybe me putting emphasis on digital technologies being more gender neutral and being a facilitator of trade reflects that I would like to invite the audience to get out of this thinking that women and technology doesn't go together. Women can take a lot of advantage of technology, and women should take ownership of these technologies. This is important for the future. They can make good use of the technologies, and they should, you are right, also become a more active player in these technologies. So investing in education in this field is important.
Absolutely. And I think there's also a very strong case to be made, not just for focusing on STEAM, but STEM, at least the arts part of the equation as well, because I think we certainly see in New Zealand a lot of digitally enabled creative economy opportunities for women. Just turning a little bit more to trade policy itself, another of the interesting findings in that WTO report has been that some of the sectors where women predominate are also those where we unfortunately also see high tariff barriers and, a disproportionate number of non-tariff barriers as well. So you mentioned textiles, also, of course, agriculture and some of the services sectors. Do you think it's useful to try to prioritise liberalisation in those sectors, or how do you see the function of removing barriers to trade as opposed to providing specific assistance to women in addressing this gender gap?
Well, there, as a trade economist, I would take a general stance and say it is best and it's useful to reduce barriers to trade in general on all sectors. How this will affect the different priorities that are being set, how will this affect women in your country will very much depend on what women in your country consume, what they produce, and what they can export. But indeed, an agenda of reducing barriers to trade is a positive agenda for women and for men.
Great. And do you think that there are particular differences in emphasis that we might want to use whether we're considering a developing economy as opposed to a more advanced economy? I mean, in New Zealand, for example, I presume we have a rather different set of challenges faced by our entrepreneurs, for example, than in a developing economy. So to what extent do you think we need to tailor solutions to the particular nature of the economy that we're dealing with?
I'm not sure whether it's possible to make a developing country, industrialized country distinction. I think it's more linked to culture, to what the role of women has been in the economy and what the legal situation for women is. I've in my career, in particular in the African region, been working with formidable female entrepreneurs that also seem to be entirely accepted in their community in that role. So in the developing world, we see a lot of entrepreneurship among women. We also see often a better uptake of new technologies among women than in the industrialized world. So I think how to tailor policies and how to tailor the emphasis of our work will very much be country specific. And one of the first items to focus on is, I would argue, to get rid of any legal type of differentiation between men and women, and to ensure that women have the right to do a business, have access to all the resources that they need, and that they do not need to get a permission from family members for this.
Absolutely. There's a very strong bias towards creating a level playing field at the very outset, isn't there, in achieving good outcomes here. Do you think there's a role for a more gender active approach to government procurement? I mean, it's a very large part of, sort of economic activity in a lot of countries. It's an area where governments could potentially actively seek to enhance the ability of women to take up a share of that market. What do you see as the role for government procurement in this space?
As you mentioned, there are numerous governments who are taking action in the area of government procurement and to make it easier for women to access that procurement. Ideally, this is done in a way that does not discriminate necessarily in favor of women. So there are issues of design. But one thing that can already be very helpful is to make sure first that female entrepreneurs know when procurement opportunities exist. Second, that they have access and easy access to the documentation, to anything they need in order to be able to fulfill the requirements for a procurement bid. And sometimes, given that, as we know, they tend to lead smaller companies, there may be an issue of them needing to team up with others or making sure that the procurements are also accessible for smaller firms. That's one of the big disadvantages they have. So yes, the procurement area is an area that is important, and it is therefore the case that agencies like ITC, for instance, were active in that field when it comes to supporting women to trade.
Thank you. Well, I just have time for one last question, and if I may, I'd like to take you to another area of great focus and passion for you, which is around sustainability. And I know that your organisation, the OECD, is shortly going to release some very interesting research on fisheries subsidies, for example. So may I just ask, to draw those threads together, do you see a gender dimension to achieving better sustainability outcomes or better environmental outcomes? Is there an interplay between greater gender equality and greater sustainability?
Well, we do know that women spend more of their income on the community, so I would therefore expect women to be potentially strong drivers for a sustainability agenda, and this is something that we should take advantage of and we should use. At the OECD, we are in our work not only focusing on fisheries, we are very much looking into the role of food systems, so on how what happens to agriculture has an effect on people, including women, as an income earner, on nutrition of families, but also on the environment, on sustainability. So we are therefore looking at the interface between these different areas, between livelihoods, nutrition, and sustainability. We are trying to introduce a gender focus into all the work we do. It's not always possible because data are missing, but increasingly our analyses are becoming more complex and are having to look at different systems at the same time.
Well, that's a very nice note to end on for a conference in New Zealand. As I'm sure you will know, we are very deeply concerned with food systems and with reducing all those environmentally harmful agriculture subsidies. So that's a wonderful place to end. Dr. Jansen, thank you so much for those great insights. You have beautifully set the scene for a great panel discussion that we have following this session. So warmest thanks from us all here in New Zealand.
Thank you for this exchange, and I wish you a successful conference. Thank you, and goodbye.
Kia ora tātou. Gives me very great pleasure to introduce today Georgina Wainwright-Kemdirim. Georgina's a senior official in the Canadian government, and she's served 14 years at the Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada Department, and more recently 20 years at Global Affairs Canada. So currently, Georgina serves as lead negotiator of Canada's inclusive trade chapters and trade agreements. These include trade and gender, SMEs, and trade and Indigenous peoples. So Georgina is clearly a really obvious expert to be joining us today to discuss gender and trade. Thank you.
Hey, Curtin, Jennfier. I'm so happy to be invited to this very important event. So, but of course, I'd much rather be in Auckland than here in Canada to do this, but will have to suffice by video. So thank you very much. So my presentation today will be on Canada's approach to inclusive trade, to trade and gender, and to gender-based analysis plus. I've just skipped the first page here. Okay, so Canada's inclusive approach to trade emerged in 2017 following extensive consultations that Global Affairs Canada ran across Canada, really with a view to understanding the sentiments of Canadians on trade policy and trade agreements. At the time, there was a lot of populist tendencies around the world, including in Canada, and we really wanted to understand where this view was coming from. There was a widespread view that trade only benefited large corporations and wealthy investors, that trade agreements were negotiated in secret, and that trade agreements really limited the government's right to regulate and reduced environmental and labor standards and rights. So we really wanted to understand this and address this. So this is how our inclusive approach to trade emerged. But honestly, at the time, it was called our Progressive Trade Agenda. So we've renamed it and it continues to evolve over time. So in terms of our trade policy, formed by extensive collection and analysis of gender disaggregated data, extensive consultations with underrepresented groups. In the fall of 2017, we established the Indigenous Working Group on Trade Policy, and we've had almost 50 meetings with them up till now. And we've also recently established a Gender and Trade Advisory Group, which include, these are all external stakeholders, academics, business leaders, business associations, other experts in the field. So we're really gaining a lot from these consultations. And on the Indigenous side, national Indigenous organizations, representative business associations, and other legal and policy experts. But a key aspect of informing our approach and our trade policy development is gender-based analysis. And I will be telling you more about that a little bit later on in my presentation. In terms of international pillars, we are very actively involved in promoting inclusive trade, related language in ministerial and leader statements at all of these different organizations that you see there on the screen. It's all with a view to, and we also engage in and support inclusive trade related projects. And then we also, our third pillar, as I said, is inclusive trade provisions in trade agreements. So our inclusive approach to trade is a two-pronged approach when it comes to negotiating trade agreements. We seek dedicated inclusive trade chapters and gender-responsive and inclusive provisions mainstreamed across the full trade agreement. And at this time, the focus is women, SMEs, and Indigenous peoples. And our inclusive trade chapters, we had our very first one in 2017 when we modernized our trade agreement with Chile, and we had our first trade and gender chapter at that time, but we continue to pursue our inclusive trade chapters in all of our trade negotiations now. Sometimes we're successful, sometimes we're not, but it's always our goal. And basically these chapters all have a similar structure. They're all cooperation based, and they basically follow this 4-article format. Another key feature of our inclusive approach to trade is the Inclusive Trade Action Group. And this is what we work on with New Zealand, of course, and with Chile. ITAG for short emerged on the margins of the signing ceremony of the CPTPP in March 2018. At that time, Canada, Chile, and New Zealand signed the Joint Declaration on Fostering Progressive and Inclusive Trade and formally established themselves as ITAG on the margins of the APEC Leaders Summit in November 2018 in Papua New Guinea. So one aspect of ITAG is that we do have an evergreen work program. And we were really happy to celebrate in August 2020 the signing of the Global Trade and Gender Arrangement, which was featured in our work program. The GTAGA is what we call it for short, and it's modeled on our Trade and Gender chapter, but it includes provisions that go beyond the standard articles that I've just described. So we bring in other gender responsive provisions from other parts of our trade agreements, and they're featured in the GTAGA, such as non-discrimination in the workplace, which comes from our labor chapter, or non-discrimination in services in terms of making sure that women can be approved to work in this, professional services like lawyers or architects or engineering in various countries. So the GTAGA is open for new participants to join. So right now, New Zealand, Canada, and Chile are very actively seeking new economies to join the arrangement. We have a big advocacy strategy that we're implementing, and we're about to start implementing activities as well, the first one being in December 10th. And the next one that we're going to be doing is a Trade in Indigenous Peoples arrangement that I expect we'll start negotiating early in the new year. And so basically ITAG, it just seeks to build this community of like-minded nations, and we're hoping that we'll have more countries join ITAG as well to join Canada, Chile, and New Zealand. Here's a nice photo I just wanted to show you celebrating our GTAGA signing ceremony. And you'll here on this page, I've just got all of our chapters and the GTAGA all provide a non-prescriptive and illustrative list of potential cooperation activities that can be undertaken by the parties to an agreement or the arrangement. And this list, I think, is just illustrative of the wide range of challenges and gaps that women face when they're seeking to participate in trade. So, the idea is that we come together, we share best practices, lessons learned, share information on a wide range of activities, as noted here. Learn from each other on programs to promote women's participation in the economy and trade, or to retain them in STEM fields, or increase participation in e-commerce, or how to improve their access to networks and incubators and value chains and procurement and financing. So this is just an example of the type of activities that we can be implementing together. And these activities are meant, for officials, but also stakeholders and businesses and experts in all different fields. We mean to include them all. So obviously, all of these activities and chapters and arrangements and provisions and FTAs, they're all really important because we know that women face challenges when they want to participate in the economy as firms or exporters. We know that women, the challenges they face is that their firms tend to be smaller, they have lower revenues and lower growth. They're survival oriented as opposed to wealth accumulation oriented. And they also tend to be focused in the services sector with lower startup costs, lower growth, and lower value added. So these are some characteristics of a typical women-owned firm, at least in Canada, but often in a global context as well. And they also lack access to a number of very important inputs to their success, like networks and financing and e-commerce and value chains. So these are challenges, as are time constraints. We know most women are very busy with a whole bunch of responsibilities, never mind just running their own business. And they face discrimination in society and in the economy, which limits their potential to grow and their propensity to export. And some, of course, also, face violence and harassment at the borders. So those are challenges. But we know that it's really important to address these challenges because we know that, when women participate in exporting, they contribute a lot to our economies. They improve national living standards. They improve GDP, and then we know that firms that export tend to be larger, more productive, more capital intensive, more skilled labor intensive, pay higher wages, and hire more diverse employees, and women in particular hire more diverse employees. They grow faster and they're more innovative. So these are all sorts of really important reasons to support women exporters and support their participation in the economy and their growth. So Canada, we certainly recognize this, and we're certainly also very much recognizing that the full and equal participation of women in our economy is essential to our future competitiveness and prosperity. So that is why in 2018, the federal government, with a $2 billion initial investment, established the Women's Entrepreneurship Strategy. This investment has now grown to $5 million because we've given additional capital to our financing crown corporations to support women's entrepreneurship, startup, and scale up, and also to our export credit agency to support their participation in trade. So the goal of the entrepreneurship strategy is to double the number of women-owned businesses by 2025, break down systemic barriers, and ensure that they do have the access to all the critical success factors that they need. As well, we have had in place, actually since 1997, the Business Women in International Trade program. This was started by a really very cool woman at our embassy in Washington back in 1997, and it has expanded and grown. Is part of the Canadian Trade Commissioner's Service, and they do provide targeted products and services to assist women-owned business to participate in trade. But with the addition of $10 million over 5 years, as announced, associated with our women's entrepreneurship strategy, they're taking on much more work and taking dedicated trade missions to traditional and emerging markets, including Japan recently, and the UK, and Germany, and France, and Korea. So, really, taking this work really seriously. But it's great that that's been around for a really long time, that program. So this leads me into the next discussion. Certainly, gender-based analysis is really central for us to deliver on our inclusive approach to trade. So what is gender-based analysis plus? I'm going to say GBA from now on. So GBA is the Government of Canada assessment process to consider how diverse groups of women and men experience policies, programs, and initiatives. And the plus, it goes beyond biological and sociocultural differences to consider overlapping identity factors. And that is what that pretty diagram is, or pretty picture is, in the top right of your screen. It basically asks us to look at, how diverse men and women who, may be disabled, or, are of different ages, or different race, or maybe Indigenous, to consider how they respond to our policies, including our trade policies. It really does put people at the heart of decision making in Canada, and it's truly changing the way we're doing trade policy as well. So our gender-based analysis approach for trade policy is a two-pronged approach as well, just like our inclusive approach to trade. So there's a quantitative side and a qualitative side. And the quantitative side does, use a lot of data, and our chief economist office does lead on this work. They use the computational general equilibrium model for economic impact analysis, and they overlay this expanded labor market module to really understand the inclusivity dimensions and effects across the economy of the trade agreement. So this labor market module takes into account gender and age and the distribution of Canadian workers across 8 different occupational groups and 57 sectors of the economy. So it's quite enormous and quite innovative. They do assess the potential impact on the economy in 2040 following the full implementation of agreement and with the assumption of full liberalization, and using data from our National Statistics Agency. And on the qualitative side, this work is done by the lead negotiator of each chapter of our trade agreement. And basically what we're asking them to do is use the data and evidence that our chief economist provides, but also do their own research, benefit from the consultations that we are doing continually, actually, and look at look at their chapter very carefully, and look at, consider what the effects of their chapter could be on men and women in the economy, in their roles as workers, business owners, and consumers, and what sectors of the economy their chapter is most likely to affect. Then we want them to look at, all these intersectional aspects of people, even, where they live, because we have such a large country, how they respond to policies, whether they live in an urban setting, rural or remote setting, and then also to consider various effects, direct effects, indirect effects, positive and negative, intended and unintended. And really, in fact, the unintended effects are what I'm really hoping people really work on, because that is where the real value added is of the gender-based analysis, because it really requires people to sort of get beyond the assumptions they make about their chapter and, oh, my chapter is great. Oh, there's all these great effects. No problem here. I've been doing it this way my whole life. Don't worry about it. Everything's good. I'm trying to ask them to look beyond their assumptions. And so that's where the real value added is, but it's the real challenge area too. So the benefits of the GBA Plus process. Certainly we are gaining a better understanding, a richer understanding of the effects of trade agreements in Canada and beyond, as well as we try and, understand the effects in the other economy as well. The GBA Plus is also supporting continuous strengthening and innovating of our FTA chapters. This is really important because it's helping us identify new opportunities for mainstreaming new inclusive and gender responsive provisions in our FTA. So we have our chapters, but we also have our desire for new provisions to be integrated across all the other chapters in the FTA. So this is where GBA is really key and really helps a lot. And we also want to be sure that we're not, perpetuating any inequalities. We also want to be able to use our trade agreements as a tool to make transformative change for women and gender equality in Canada and globally. So that there's challenges, though, for sure. Overcoming resistance to doing things differently is one key area, as I've mentioned. Moving beyond the traditional assumptions in trade policy that, trade is gender neutral or trade is gender blind, or everyone has equal access and equal opportunity. We don't have to change anything here. These are assumptions that it's hard for people to sort of get beyond. Certainly, do we have the gender disaggregated data we need to really dive deep into this? That can be a challenge. And of course, some see GBA Plus as a zero-sum game, that men will lose if women receive equitable access. And, we know that's not true. The pie is not finite, and there's room for everyone in trade and in trade policy. So I just want to leave you with a few key messages. For Canada, we certainly understand that inclusive trade, is beneficial. We need this, and it will lead to more support for trade. And then the more trade that is sustainable, then that's best for Canada, because we are very highly trade-dependent country. We also know that inclusive trade and ensuring women's participation in trade is good for the economy, and is a key consideration as we design our post-COVID-19 economic and trade recovery. We want a sustainable and inclusive trade recovery. And of course, GBA Plus is a disruptor, and it's a policy innovation tool. So it really does help support change, and this is really key for Canada. So that's it. Thank you.
I really liked the range of activities that you're putting out there as a suggestion to promote the ITAG activities going forward. So I think I counted around 15. But if we had to prioritise some activities to get started under the gender initiative between our three countries, so when I say we, I'm talking New Zealand right now, and we wanted to demonstrate impact within a year, so that it would help with the promulgation to other countries perhaps, but also to our domestic audience and to our policymakers. What do you think of those 15 or 14 activities would be the best ones for us to focus on?
Right. Okay, no, I think that's a really good question. Well, maybe I'm a little biased, but I think one key thing that that New Zealand could do would be to start doing your own gender-based analysis of your own trade agreements and your own trade policy. I'm certainly aware that New Zealand is involved in some international negotiations right now, so they can be bringing a gender lens to their to their trade agreements and to their, why not just see what comes out of it. You might come up with really new and cool ideas and provisions, and your partners might be very receptive. And if they're not, I'm sure New Zealand could convince them. The other thing that I think would be really valuable, even in these COVID times, would be to have, women's trade missions. We could even work together, Canada, New Zealand, and Chile, to have a virtual trade mission and some virtual networking events. Maybe we should be doing something particular on e-commerce and digital trade, ensuring that, women-owned businesses have access to the skills and the infrastructure they need to participate in digital trade, and, maybe doing a trade mission in the e-commerce world. Maybe this might be something really cool. And see, another thing that I'm seeing more of is, some of these large companies are sort of setting aside, 15% of our purchases will come from women-owned businesses or from Black-owned businesses. I mean, that would be something great to really inspire, women's entrepreneurship and development. I think the other thing that we really need to do, and this is very much so in Canada as well, is really start to see how we can measure and show results from this work. This is a gap, I think. We can point to things, but to show real change is happening. And, I think we've got our benchmarks in place in terms of, where are we starting from? But we've been doing this now for 2 or 3 years. I think measuring and showing results, and how do we really do that? That will be a challenge. It might be fun to work with New Zealand on that too.
Yes, I think in this world of evidence-based policymaking and the desire to see results, especially as governments change, to keep the momentum going, irrespective of who's in government, would be invaluable in terms of those measures, if you like, or KPIs that demonstrate that targets are being met. If you were talking to us or telling us a bit more about how to get trade negotiators and other trade policy people to think about GBA plus or another type. In our country, we now have the Bringing Gender In tool for policy analysts. What kind of training did you give your trade negotiators and your trade policy analysts in terms of to ensure that they were familiar and that there was buy-in, particularly from middle managers, perhaps, to ensure that this gender lens was applied?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question too, and we've done a number of things. Certainly, having a system within our trade policy branch at Global Affairs Canada, from the top down. I mean, our assistant deputy minister is very supportive, and we have a director general, GBA champion, who really promotes it and really believes in it and supports me in the work that I'm doing a lot. Certainly early on, and we use it to this day, although I have modified it a bit, is a guidance template, like key questions that you need to consider as you're doing your analysis. There's a set of questions for the ex-ante approach, which we applied to our Canada-Mercosur trade negotiations, and are still ongoing because those aren't concluded yet. And then the ex-post approach, where we applied gender-based analysis to our finalized agreement with the US and Mexico. And so we had a different set of questions and different process there. So guidance in that sense, but also Women and Gender Equality Canada, our Ministry for Women, they, for the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years, have had an online GBA learning tool. And this is, since September 2019, has been mandatory for all trade policy officials in our department to take. Up to now, we have about a 75% completion rate. We're going for 100%. It's tracked, and we harass people who haven't done the work. So this is an online tool, but it's not specific to trade policy. But what we're doing on trade policy, and this has been going on for about 3 years now, is that we have a customized in-person course that is run by the Canadian Foreign Service Institute that provides, training to foreign service officers on a whole bunch of different issues, including now on GBA+. And I've worked with them to develop a customized course for trade policy and GBA+. And the fourth iteration of that course will take place over the first 2 weeks of December, half a day over 3 days online. And we have to do it this way, of course, this time. So we have this customized course, and we have customized trade policy case studies where we apply GBA thinking to them. I developed those last year. So that's another tool that we have. And of course, in my job, part of it is just reaching out and harassing people and coaching people and challenging people and frankly doing their work. Sometimes, because I just, okay, you don't get it. Okay, give me your chapter. I will read it and figure it out for you. But then I also get them to do additional work as well. So it takes a lot, and we still have some gaps in this work, but it's an evolving field, and we're learning as we go. So but I am building buy-in in my colleagues and allies and friends even.
Oh, it sounds great. So then just a final COVID question. It's it's sort of the big thing that we can't ignore. And I think I'm really interested in any specific programs that you've put in place to advance the more equitable sharing of the benefits of trade, taking COVID into account. So noticed, that the Women in Entrepreneurship scheme that you've got and the massive investment that you've put into that. Do you imagine that there's more work to do in that space given COVID and the way in which and some economies are focusing on more traditional investment strategies that bolster the more male-dominated areas of our economy compared to ones where women may have a comparative advantage, and Canada may also have a comparative advantage if women in those sectors are boosted?
Yeah, exactly. No, that's a really, really good point. I mean, we all know that, in the COVID economy, vulnerable populations have been disproportionately affected. Women-owned businesses, of course, because they tend to be in the services sector, which have just had to be so dramatically shut down. So, what our government did do over the last several months, they've invested hundreds of millions of dollars into targeted programming. So, for example, the Women's Entrepreneurship Strategy that I've told you about, in May, the government added $15 million boost. So existing recipients, could benefit from this additional funding to keep their doors open and keep participating in the economy and trade. In August, we provided an additional $133 million to Indigenous-owned businesses to support their recovery and also their continued openness to business. So this was for Indigenous-owned businesses, but also community-owned businesses for our different Indigenous groups in Canada. And also in September, we established a Black entrepreneurship program and invested over $220 million in partnership with Canadian financial institutions to help thousands of Black business owners, again, keep their doors open and recover from the crisis and grow their businesses. So we've done these, three additional funding programs. One area that our Minister Ng for International Trade is very interested in really promoting digital trade and e-commerce and making sure that all of these groups and all SMEs really go digital and really sort of supporting their access and their training and their ability to use digital trade in trade. So I think we all know that without digital trade, where would we be right now? And this is I think this is well recognized, and we're really focusing on that area as well.
Well, Georgina, that was just great. And there's obviously a lot for us here in New Zealand to learn from Canada. So on behalf of everyone here at ATEPS, the Auckland Trade and Economic Policy School of 2020, I would like to thank you for your time today, and we look forward to further knowledge mobilisation and knowledge transfer between our two countries on this topic.
Okay, thank you very much, and I look forward to that as well. I'm sure we have lots to benefit from our work with New Zealand. Thank you very much. Okay, bye everyone. Thank you. Enjoy your conference.